Commended to the House.
I call the honourable member Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Like members who have spoken in the debate before me, I would like to pay tribute to our Defence Force personnel who serve us so magnificently and represent us so well overseas in places like Afghanistan, in the Solomon Islands, in Timor-Leste, and all around the world under UN-mandated missions and other missions. There is no doubt that our Defence Forces are highly regarded, highly respected, and that regard and respect reflects on New Zealand as a nation. I would like to pay particular tribute briefly to Flying Officer Dan Gregory, Flight Lieutenant Hayden Madsen, Corporal Ben Carson, Corporal Doug Grant, Lance Corporal Leon Smith and Lieutenant Tim O'Donnell and their families, those men all being lost to us in the last couple of years, whilst serving in operations and carrying out tasks asked of them by their superiors and by the government. Mr Speaker, I think it's important that parliamentarians and government ministers always acknowledge that we send our Defence Force personnel into harm's way to do tasks that we ask of them. And it is in that spirit, Mr Speaker, that I want to talk about this bill, because we are seeing quite a lot of dissatisfaction within the Defence Forces about what is happening under this national government. In fact, I think the Minister, Jonathan Coleman, is probably looking for some good news, because the news has all been bad. The news has been about the lowest recorded morale within the Defence Forces since we started measuring morale. The lowest ebb ever has occurred under the watch of this Minister, Jonathan Coleman. We also know that the Defence Forces are struggling to meet the expectations set upon them by this government to find $350 to $400 million worth of, we'll call them savings, some might call them cuts, Mr Speaker, in order to meet the expectations that this government has put upon them. And really, the truth is, if we read the briefing to the incoming minister, that the Defence Force, try as they might, are an awfully long way away from meeting those expectations. And we have to ask, are we going down the same path that we saw when National was in government during the 1990s, when our military forces were completely underfunded, under-resourced, their equipment wasn't kept up to date, and they found themselves in real strife when deployed overseas and unable, literally, to keep up with our allies. So I have no doubt that this minister is looking forward to some good news, and I have some good news for the Minister, Dr Hutchison. That good news is that Labour will support this bill to the Select Committee. We do want to hear the debate. We want to hear what people have to say about this bill. And we do want to hear some of the issues looked through. Absolutely, Dr Hutchison. Mr Goff is in support of this, but Mr Goff absolutely rightly was pointing out the lacklustre leadership that we have seen from the National Party in the defence portfolio. You may not have, Dr Hutchison may not, my apologies, Mr Speaker, Dr Hutchison may not have picked up on that in Mr Goff's speech, but I can assure you he is in support of seeing this bill go to Select Committee. We reserve our position after then because we want to hear the issues debated. We want to have the conversation. We want to have the conversation. There are this bill. Essentially, this bill facilitates a number of things which have fallen out of the white paper and the value for money review exercise. I think it's important to point out, Mr Speaker, that every initiative that is put in place that has been put in place following that value for money exercise, not one of those initiatives has actually realised the savings that were anticipated in that value for money exercise. It always comes up short, and that is why the Defence Force is struggling so much to meet those very extreme expectations that were placed upon them. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to touch on some of the main components of this bill and perhaps raise some of the issues that we would like to see debated at Select Committee. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, it is true that this bill vests an awful lot of responsibility and power in the Chief of Defence Force, a lot of responsibility which has been shared across a number of positions, the chiefs of the different services and who jointly have advised the Minister currently. A lot of that is being concentrated in one person, the Chief of Defence Force. And so, you absolutely want to know that you've got that appointment right. And you want to know that there are some. We want to know that there are some checks and balances to ensure that power is appropriately concentrated in the Chief of Defence Force. Because now, under this legislation, the Chief of Defence Force will now have the authority to appoint the chiefs of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, whereas previously that was a role that the government had. Now the Chief of Defence Force will have that role. And the Chiefs of Services themselves lose the responsibility and the ability to advise the Minister. The sole advisor in that Defence Force management team is again the Chief of Defence Force. So again, a lot of concentration of the responsibility in the Chief of Defence Force. And as has been rightly pointed out, for the purpose of seeing more direct leadership of joint forces, the Chief of Defence Force will now command the armed forces directly rather than through the service chiefs. There is considerable concentration of authority and responsibility in the Chief of Defence Force in those changes, and we would like to hear some of the discussion around what possible issues may arise from that. Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out, currently the various chiefs of the three services, as well as CDF, have a responsibility for advising the Minister, and the head of each service has the responsibility for advising the Minister about matters relating to that service. That will no longer be the case. And that group of advisors is now going to be replaced by a Defence Advisory Board, which will be appointed by the Minister himself. Now, here we have, again, some question marks. Who will be appointed to that board? What will be the qualifications for being appointed to that board? And what is the mechanism for doing so? And I suppose there are some questions. Will this construction of this advisory board be a mechanism for future cuts, for further cuts, for greater influence from outside the Defence Force to perhaps bring a private sector view on the Defence Force, a privatisation agenda into the Defence Force? And indeed, I note that it's set out in the bill how these people are to be remunerated. One hopes that we won't see more political appointments like the types that we've seen in New Zealand on air on that Defence Advisory Board. So, Mr. Speaker, again, an issue there that we're interested in seeing borne out. The territorials and reserves. So territorials will cease to exist, and instead of having territorial and reserve forces, now what is proposed in this legislation is active reserves and inactive reserves. Now, are those active reserves going to be used to replace regular force personnel? That's a very important question that we want to hear borne out and discussed in greater detail. And what will be the role of those inactive reserves? We have great concerns on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, that full-time regular force personnel, that their role is going to be replaced by these so-called active reservists. And how many reserves will there be? We've heard about how the government plans to cut the number of territorials, but then they want to introduce this reserve force. They seem to be sometimes contradicting their own views, so we do want to hear more. Mr. Speaker, I can see that my time is coming to an end. I just want to finally say that on the issue of civilianisation, we are very happy to see that members of the armed forces, if they are civilianised, will be able to be moved directly into the civil service. That should have happened over a year ago before the civilianisation process began. But, Mr Speaker, on that we are happy to support this Select Committee, and we look forward to those issues being explored further.
I call the honourable member Jackie Dean.
Mr Speaker.